Thank you. Um, okay, so welcome. As you heard in the video, we are going to just do 5 weeks here. We'll be staying in the Gospel of Luke. Um, I recently got a book that it's not easy reading, but if you're at all intrigued by these texts, it will be interesting reading for you. It's by Chad Myers, whom some of you may know. He has a ministry called Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries. Um, he's a very profound thinker. He's got two books out on the Gospel of Mark. One is called Who Will Roll Away the Stone, the other called Binding the Strong Man. They're very dense and difficult to read. I'm finding his book on Luke to be more accessible, and it's called Healing Affluenza and Resisting Plutarchy. Healing affluenza. So affluenza is a great word that was created somewhere along the line. Obviously, a play on words from influenza, and it's the illness that comes from having too much. The lectionary that we're following skipped a story about someone having too much, but there are plenty of stories in Luke's gospel where it's possible that you can have too much. So healing affluenza and resisting plutocracy. Plutocracy means when you see the ending crassy, it talks about your form of government, right? So democracy is the government of the people, autocracy is the government of the autocrats, and so forth. Plutocracy is the government of the rich, based on the Greek word for wealth, plutos. Um, so that's his angle, that what the Gospel of Luke is about is healing affluenza and resisting governance by the rich or the powerful. You know, there are a number of ways to describe that. So that's the name of the book, Healing Affluenza and Resisting Plutocracy. Um, and you can also, if you would want to, you can sign up for a weekly email from Chad Meyer. It's not Chad, it's Ched. And he basically takes the lectionary text for each week, and it looks like it's a section out of his book about that text. Very insightful. And so I'm just saying, if you're intrigued and you're ready to hear a voice other than mine, that's one that I would recommend. Ched Myers. Um, I My copy of the book is at home. I'll bring it next week so you can all kind of get a gander of it. All right. So we are in Luke's gospel, and Deborah, did you want to raise your question before we get started?
It wasn't really a question, it was a commentary, really. I was just wondering why the translators of the text didn't use to be able instead of cannot, because that changes it significantly.
Yeah.
At least it did to me.
Yeah, and and you're asking the question I ask time after time, um, because I do think the tiny little things like that matter. I think the best, uh, maybe one of the best tools you can have, and for those of you online, if you didn't hear that, I point out that the word dunamai really is about ability. Not having the power is not able. And it consistently in the New Revised Standard Translation gets translated cannot, which doesn't necessarily mean something different, but it's also not quite the same. That's the way the English language works. So I don't think it's of any ill will or even sloppiness or laziness on their part. Um, but you know, when you're translating entire books and you're negotiating every verse, sometimes you just kind of let momentum carry you for the translation. I'm trying to be very generous. I wish they would be a little more precise. Now, if you go to my blog, for example, I will have as literal of a translation as I possibly can. But that would never work for a Bible. You do not want a Bible that is translated that way because it's very wooden. The Greek language doesn't work quite in the same way that English does. The best example, if you translate something from German, they always put their verbs last. And if you translated that order in English, it would just drive you bonkers. Because our verbs do not put last, right? that just sounds weird to do that. So Greek is a different language. It's not just different vocabulary. The structure is somewhat different. And so you have the literal translation where you can see that each word could go in several different directions. Then you have the wooden translation where I try to put it in a sentence structure. That's what I do. I specify on my blog, this is a rough translation. Because when you print a Bible, you want a smooth translation, and you have to pay attention to the other factor, which is readability. Somebody's got to be able to read through it without stumbling all over themselves because of the word order, or because are not able may not work as smoothly as cannot. So yeah, I don't think it's ill will. And I don't think it's laziness. I think it's a matter of trying to make the reading smoother. And it would be in their judgment that the difference between is not able and cannot is not so large that they'd rather go with the smoother reading.
But it was very large when I was reading it, and then.
I feel like it's large.
Because cannot sounded to me like you are forbidden.
Right, that's my concern.
Yeah, and where able is, you're not able to because you can't meet these
Yeah,
criteria.
you don't have what it takes.
Right.
I do think that's a huge difference.
Mhm.
And that's why we need Bible teachers. I'm putting up for my tradition here. Sometimes sometimes it does make a difference. And that's why I'm passionate about this, is to at least offer other ways of reading a text that might make it more, not less challenging, but more understandable, or bring a broader understanding. So I will point those things out, and I do it without ire. I just do it because I think it's interesting. Okay, so let's start with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll read the text before we carry this on any further. Gracious God, we want to follow. We wonder if we are able. We wonder if we will. We wonder whether we have too much. We wonder if we are giving in to powers that should not be directing our lives. So with all of these questions of true discipleship, we ask that you give us the ability to read your scripture with the confidence of knowing your love for us, but also with the boldness of claiming our love for you. Amen. Okay, so we are in Luke chapter 14. We're going to read 25 through 33. I think for the sake of those who are watching online, I'm going to read it from up here so they can hear it a little bit better. And this is the New Revised Standard Version. Now, large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation or is unable to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So, therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. And I expect on Saturday and Sunday, when I read that and say, this ends the reading, to hear a great sigh of relief. Thanks be to God, right? All right. So I'm not kidding when I say this is a difficult text, right? And let's look for a moment at the list of those we're supposed to hate. All right. Let me. Oh, yeah, so. All right. So we have father and mother and wife. We don't have husband. Sorry. And children.
It's a given.
It's a gift. I wasn't going to say that.
That is not nice. And children, and brother and sister, and your own life. The word translated life, there are several Greek words that can be translated life. There's bio, words based on that root from which we get biography, biology, and so forth. There's zoo, from which we get zoology, typically means some form of animal life. And there's psyche, from which we get our words psychologist, psychiatrist, psychiatric, psycho, all those words. Sometimes that is translated mind, although there's a better word for mind. Sometimes it's translated soul. Often it's translated soul. So this could read
6-1, 3,006,
all right. This could read, even your own soul is not able to be my disciple. But that's a judgment call. There's no one better translation or the other. Yes, sure.
was reading this and all of the other words coming from one writing this. Could the word hating mean something else?
Well, let's see. It possibly could. I want to say there are some things that are possible, but they're better as a last resort and not a first resort. Okay? So if you're ever in a Bible study and the very first thing they do is try to say, well, the word hate doesn't necessarily mean hate. It could mean this and that and the other thing. It's not that they're wrong. I think they're hasty. I think we ought to let the impact of the word have its meaning, because typically when that word occurs, it's hate, hate, not nice hate. All right. So we have to be aware that what we don't want to do, and I'm really trying to emphasize this in the video as well as throughout, what we don't want to do is, just because it jars us, try to get away from it. You are beloved children of God. You get to do this, but you get to look at it head on. And let's imagine first that it means hate. And ask ourselves, how do we read a text that says something like that? And then after holding that discomfort for a while, we will look at another instance where that word comes up that might give us a different perspective. Okay, does that make sense? So yes is the answer to your question. There are other ways of hearing that word, and we will get there. But first, let's let it jar us for a bit. Does that work? All right. You can always do that because God loves you. That's what you know going into the text, not that what we're there to find out. Okay? We read it as beloved children of God. Okay, so let's just let the word hate hurt right now. And I ask you to come to class having thought of perhaps other scriptures that would tell you not to hate your father, your mother, your wife, children, your brother, sister, even your soul. Did you come up with any?
Ten Commandments.
All right, we got the Ten Commandments, right? Honor your mother and your father, and one would think that hating them is not a practice of honoring, and that's not a leap. That's obvious. So in the main, the scriptures don't teach us you should hate your parent, right? That's an unusual and provocative phrase. All right, what about hating your spouse, husband or wife over there? Any scriptures that you can think of that mitigate against hating your spouse?
Yeah, you said it, Paul in Ephesians, isn't that, is always said at wedding ceremonies?
Yeah. Well, yes. There are a couple of places. One's in Ephesians, one in Colossians. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. That mitigates against that entirely. We often at weddings read 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter. That's not specifically talking about relationships between spouses or lovers, but it is love. And it does call that the chief of all the gifts, right? The greatest gift is love. So, I mean, that's the trump card you could pull out and say, yeah, all of them are wrong. Love is what we're supposed to do. But specifically, Paul does say, or whoever's writing Ephesians and Colossians says specifically, husbands, love your wife. So this is not a general biblical teaching that sits easily with us. Now, it's a curious thing. In the creation story where you have Adam and Eve, and they become, the first couple, and Jesus will refer to that story when asked about the question of divorce. And he will say, Moses allowed you to write a certificate of divorce. But the intention is, in the beginning, God created them male and female so that they could be together, so that he would leave his family and join her, and so forth. It's not in Genesis 1. It's not in Jesus' argument about Genesis 1. The word love doesn't come up. So I don't read Genesis 1 generally at weddings. That is about procreation. That's about how we get to be who we are. It's not really about feelings, as it were, or disposition, however you like to think about the word love. But there are plenty of places where we are to love our parents, or at least to honor them. Plenty of places we are to love our spouse. What about your children?
I don't have children as such, but I like Galatians 5:23 through 24. Love, patience.
Yeah, the fruit of the Spirit.
To everybody, so.
Right,
And against that, there is no law.
right.
So I think that can erase the hate, all of that.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's very much in the same cloth as 1 Corinthians 13. So Paul talks about the works of the flesh, and you've got all kinds of malicious stuff. And then he talks about the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, kindness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance, against which there's no law. If you ever want a memory verse, that's it. Galatians 5:22 and 23. But love is first there, and it does seem to be the chief of the virtues of the good life. We have seen places in Mark, Luke, and Matthew where Jesus' mother and brothers come to fetch him because they think perhaps he's lost his mind. Some people are accusing him of acting under the power of Beelzebul, the chief of the demons, right? And so Mary and I think Gospel of Mark mentions two brothers and a sister who come to fetch him. And he's told, your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside. And Jesus asks, well, who are my mother and brother and sister? And anyone who does the word of God and keeps it is my mother, my brother, and my sister, and my, in my family. So we do have a sense in Mark's gospel that Jesus puts his ministry and his commitment to the reign of God above his place in the family. Okay? So we've already seen that before we get to this part of Luke. And it's something to take under consideration. Jesus was willing to be separated from his family in order to engage in the ministry he did. And if they're coming to get him because they think he's crazy, he's not going with them. And shortly thereafter, when he goes home to the church in Nazareth, people are offended because they say, who does this guy think he is? Isn't his mother Mary? Aren't his brothers here with us? Isn't he just the son of the carpenter? Joseph seems to be dead by then. So there is a sense that Jesus' ministry and mission takes him out of the family structure into something that for him is more important. So, Shirley, we're coming back to your question, whether the word hate could mean something like detaching to do something else more important. You know what I mean?
I do.
Yeah.
Because when I was reading it, I tried to put something else and I thought, well, if you read it and it says, if anyone comes to me without setting aside his mother, father, that sort of thing, kind of makes sense. And then I realized too that we grow up with this terrible feeling about the word hate. I know as a child, that was like a cuss word.
Yeah, we couldn't say it either.
So like you say, the hate jumps out at us because
Right.
we've kind of been scheduled to not use that word.
Right. Yeah, and it's rightly jarring and offensive. Whether it's literal or not in its worst sense is the right question. So we have moments when you're supposed to love your parents, love your spouse, love your children, maybe your brothers and sisters. I don't know, but you are supposed to love in general. And now we're being told that anyone who does not hate all of the above is not able to be my disciple. And again, going back to the point that Deborah was remembering, it doesn't mean Jesus says, I won't let you be my disciple. It means you don't have the wherewithal to be my disciple. So, forsaking all others and wedding oneself to Christ is what this language is about. Does that sound familiar? Because that's the language we use in a marriage, right? Forsaking all others, you wed yourself to someone else. You cut off the possibility of following up that potential relationship that you had with that person in high school. Even if you meet them again on Facebook, if you're married to someone else, you have cut off that possibility of reengaging, right? That's one way of hearing hate is forsaking all others. That doesn't mean you want them to die and that you don't speak to them if they pass you on the road, but it means that you don't have this relationship that you're making. Pat?
What if you put in, you disavow the influence of each of these people?
Yeah.
Kowtow to what mother and father said, that you do your own thing and come
Yeah, that's a great commentary right there. Turn the word hate into disavow the influence of these others. Not that they're bad people and not that you can't be kind and send them birthday cards or something, but it does mean that I have decided to follow Jesus, right? That kind of thing. Judy.
I found 4 other translations yesterday. They used, substituted refuses to let go. Another one said, you must love me more than,
Yeah.
and, that description, there was complementary ways of describing complete commitment. And one that said to disregard.
Yeah. Love me more than, I mean, obviously someone's trying to make that happier reading for everybody. It's got more of an edge than that. But the reason someone might go with that in the smooth translation, admittedly, it's not the literal translation, right? There's a phrase that happened in the Old Testament, and it's cited several times in the New Testament. And in the Old Testament, it's part of the story of Jacob and Esau. And you might remember that in many of those stories, God chooses the younger over the older to be the preferred son. It's always about sons. And so Jacob and Esau were twins, but Esau came out first. And Jacob, whose name means heel grabber, came out holding onto his heel second. So by the laws, which reflect the times, and this was true not just for Israel, the elder son got like half of the inheritance, and all the other 20 sons had to split the rest. It was and part of that. Well, we can talk about why, but it was always the preference of the older over the younger. And in the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Isaac was not the oldest. Ishmael was the oldest. But Isaac was, at least the way the Jews tell the story, not the way the Muslims tell it. In Isaac was the chosen. Jacob was chosen over Esau. Joseph was honored over his 10 older brothers. So there's always that, Walter Brueggemann would call it the law of inversion, turning things upside down from the expectation of the order. And the phrase in the Old Testament at one point has to do with God expressing being on Jacob's side and saying, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. Now, if you read the story, honestly, Esau's kind of a he-man, and he's a little bit dumb. He sells his birthright because he's just really hungry. He gets tricked into losing his blessing because his brother puts on goat skins and acts like he's the hairy son, not the smooth son. There's all this stuff. But when they meet each other years later and they have children and they have armies and they have power, Jacob is scared. He's worried that Esau is going to kill him. So when Jacob goes to meet Esau, when he comes back home after being, in his father-in-law's land for many years, he does what all noble people do. He put the children and his wives up front and his slaves, and then he was in the back. And Esau, comes riding up and asks, what is this? What are you doing? He said, I wasn't sure if you were going to come in war or in peace. And Esau was like, we're brothers. Why would I come to you in war? Like Esau ends up being a lot nobler and likable than Jacob. So why? Why would God love Jacob, prefer Jacob over Esau first? And the answer is, these are Israelites telling the story. And Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And he was the father of the 12 tribes. Esau was the head of the Edomites. They were enemies at times. There were times throughout their history where the people of Jacob, the Israelites, would fight against the Edomites. And the question is, on whose side is God? Well, Jacob have I loved. Esau have I hated. means that God is on our side. So there's a very self-interested way that these stories are told by the Jewish people. And if you ever want to get the inside scoop, just ask a Jewish scholar. They'll tell you. Yes, this is our stories, our people's story. Those people had their own stories, and God thought quite differently in their story. But that phrase, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated, yeah, there's nothing in the story that makes it look like God looked at Esau and thought, oh, you piece of filth. I just can't stand you. You have bad breath, your feet stink, and you're ugly, and your mom dresses you funny. None of that. But it is a sign of preference. So when you said preferred, I imagine that's what's in the mind of the people who went with that translation, because when it's quoted in the New Testament several times, it always seems to be why God prefers Israel over other nations. Why Israel are the people of covenant. And Paul will cite, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. God, for whatever reason, and God can do this, God can choose and prefer one over the other. So there are instances where this word hate, as harsh as it is, points to something other than, feelings of, hatred, but more like preference. Why it is God has chosen this people, and so forth. So that can put your mind at ease a little bit. I think we ought to let it rankle us some. Jesus is not unaware that he's using difficult language here. Okay? So that's the first thing. Someone who doesn't prefer me over all their family, even our closest family, does not have what it takes to be a disciple. That's hard. The next verse I want to suggest is exactly the same thing. Whoever does not carry their cross does not have what it takes to be my disciple. Now, I did ask you a question to think about regarding this. In story time, Jesus is talking to the crowd, and Jesus is not dead yet. He hasn't suffered the crucifixion yet. What do you think the phrase carry a cross means to this crowd in story time? I know what it means to you. What do you think it meant to them in that moment? That's the first level of reading the story.
Wasn't this the way that the Romans killed people, was by putting them up on crosses?
It is one way that Romans killed people, is by putting them up on crosses. It's
They would make the people carry their crosses to the place.
yeah, I don't know if that's a tradition or not. It certainly was something Jesus was forced to do, and that got a little help doing that. But that would make sense, right? That what we're talking about is somebody who's on the road to execution. And for the immediate audience in the story, this isn't a Christian thing. It's a horrible thing that the Romans do. The Romans got it from, I think, the Persians. And the reason it was so terrible is not like someone being hung, although it's similar in some respects. And it's not like having your head cut off or a gas chamber. It's a horrible, torturous, obscene, because usually you're naked, and it's all about this displaying how the empire has total control over you. You can't move, you can't resist. They can poke you with things, they can spit on you, they can call you things. There's not a thing you can do about it. And you will die. And in order to breathe, you have to push up on your feet. If your feet are nailed to the cross, it's painful. You can't do that eternally, so you will hang, and you will slowly suffocate. Unless you've been tortured enough to where you bleed to death, it's suffocation. And it's slow, and you're a spectacle. It's a horrible thing. And I can't imagine a human being ordering that or doing that to another human being. But I can't imagine a human being ordering or doing what happened last week when some 4-year-old children were awakened at 2 a.m. and put on a bus and carried to an airport where they were getting ready to be shipped off to Guatemala, and they'll only stop because the judge ordered them to be stopped. I can't imagine that kind of cruelty, but it happens, and it's happened for years. So, yes, everybody there knows what it means to die on a cross. That's the kind of thing that Rome saved mostly for criminals, but not just your ordinary criminals. Usually someone who they thought was seditious and trying to overthrow the government. Okay? So it does have some valence to them. It has a different sort of meaning for us. Carrying the cross means we know what Jesus did. And this is, we've heard Jesus say over and over again that he's going to be crucified, and whoever would be my disciple must take up their cross and follow me. How is that any different than hating your parents and your kids and your wife and your siblings and your own life? Because the last thing your parents want you to do is take up a cross and go die. And the last thing your spouse wants you to do is to give up your life. They want you to live and to be with them and participate with them. That's what families do. And so it strikes me that the words in verse 26 or 27 are really substantially not much different from verses 25 and 26. In fact, 25 and 26 probably is a little more of an honest picture that if you're willing to give your life for something, then that means you're willing to break the hearts of all the people who don't want you to die. See what I mean? If you're, Will, I don't want to say too much more because I have to preach on this on Sunday. So I think verse 27 is just as hard as verses 25 and 26, and essentially mean the same thing, but obviously the language is not quite as provocative. And the minute we see a cross, we usually think it's got religious meaning, and for Jesus' immediate audience, it had very literal meaning. This means death. Okay, any questions? All right, let's push forward then. Because I don't even know what time it is. How great is that? Oh, we want to hurry. Okay, so Jesus gives 2 examples. And these examples, now, if you're going to illustrate what it means to hate your parents and your kids, you could come up with better examples than this. I mean, if the point is you got to hate everybody that loves you, man, I could think of wonderful examples. Wes Anderson movies, horror flicks, those novels that I don't read. Jesus gives 2 examples of what he's talking about, and neither of them involve hating somebody with your heart. Okay, so this should teach it that the impact of that first statement is not the impact that Jesus is after, it's the depth of it, right? So the question is, which of you planning to build a tower? None of them was going to build a tower. It took money and influence and slave work to build a tower. But if you were one of those people, and you were going to build a tower, I mean, wouldn't you count the cost first? Would you start out on something just reckoning that you're going to be able to finish it? And then after doing all the work of laying the foundation, which Jesus had mentioned in an earlier parable about building a house, digging down to the foundation. So this is somebody who's preparing to build something that's going to last. And you get halfway there. It's kind of like 2008, isn't it? Where a bunch of people had building projects going on, and then suddenly the economy crashed, and they were half done. And you become ridiculed at that point. There's no hate in that story. It's just somebody thought they had the means and they didn't, because they didn't sit down and think through the cost first, right? That's the illustration Jesus uses. Nothing about, treating your mom badly. The second illustration is a little more violent, but it's, there's a funny phrase in the Old Testament that in the spring, when the kings go out to war, da 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 da. And just kind of said it so casually, like, oh, look, it's spring, time to make war. Yeah, just something we do. So which of you, being a king going out to war, doesn't at least ask yourself the question whether this is going to work? Now, not enough people ask that. If you ask the people on the front row, the privates that go into battle first, right? George Bernard Shaw said, the way you have peace is everybody shoots their generals and goes home. But the question is, are you going to step into a war when you have 10,000 troops and they have 20? Self-evident, no, is the answer. I do think this is speaking to something that had just happened. I gave you in the video a little bit of the history of the Jewish revolt between 66 to 70 that was decisively defeated with the destruction of the temple and the ruin of Jerusalem. Most people feel that Mark's gospel was written during that time, somewhere in between 66 to 70, maybe a little later, maybe a little earlier. Mark chapter 13 is kind of a really dark chapter, and it seems to be indicating the destruction of the temple. Matthew and Luke are writing probably 15 years after that. But that's still, that's their 9/11 is the destruction of the temple. And it was brought on because some revolutionaries thought that they had the wherewithal to defeat the Roman Empire. And not all, but Rome sent in a legion, and it was all over. And there are frescoes and monuments that were built showing the General Titus carrying the gold ornamentation from the temple back to Rome to say, we defeated you and your God. So there was an ongoing argument whether we should revolt against Rome or if this is a fool's errand. And in that, I would imagine that at least for the people in the story time, that's an important thing to remember. I think for Luke writing to his audience, that's an important, this is a very fresh and painful example. That should not have happened. But the similarity between the two is someone just didn't count the cost, or they did in the second, and they decided to sue for peace instead of waging war. So those two examples tell us that those harsh verses we read to begin, 25, 26, and 27, the question is, are you able, do you have the wherewithal? Are you considering what the cost is here? And if you haven't considered the cost, knowing that you're going to have to prefer something to your family, You're going to have to listen to the influence of someone other than those you've been taught to listen to all your life. If you're not ready to do that, you're just really not ready to be my disciple. Now, you may love Jesus, you may have your sins forgiven. There are plenty of other scriptures about that, but he's talking about being my disciple, following me, and the incredible cost of doing that. So after saying all of that, this is the part that really stuns me a little bit about this text. And that's verse 35. I want you to look at the first two words. I'm sorry, verse 33. I'm sorry. I was wondering why I didn't have verse 35 here. Verse 33, the first two words. So, therefore, right? So, therefore. And that's very literal. The word therefore is something we call a post-positive word. It usually appears second, and normally you translate it first. But the word so is also one. So you have two of them together. In conclusion, Jesus said. So if you're still asking yourself the question, what does it mean to hate my parents, hate my kids, hate my family, hate my own life, to take up and carry a cross? If you're still asking yourself, what does this mean? Here Jesus says, in conclusion. So, therefore, in sum, this is what we're saying. None of you are able, have the wherewithal to be my disciples if you do not give up all your possessions. If you do not forsake, it doesn't say hate, give up all your possessions. Okay. That sounds hard, but at least it doesn't sound harsh.
I thought
Right?
it sounded very harsh.
What's that?
I thought it sounded very.
Do you
harsh.
think give up all your possessions?
Well,
It-
it's, you know,
Yeah, I mean, it sounds costly.
yes.
It's not as mean, perhaps, as hating your mom and your dad.
Well, that was very harsh.
Yeah, okay. So relatively a little less harsh, but still incredibly difficult, right? Unless you're willing to give up all your possessions. Someone who gets deployed into the army, into a live battle, has to leave home, and may never come back. So, going into battle, the possibility is they'll never see their dog again. This would make a great country song. Never see their wife again, never see the house again, never see the old homestead again, right? But that's the cost of being deployed in a military context. One would hope that you come out intact, right? And we pray that people do. And when it's people we love, we don't really want them, we don't pray for them to kill other people, but we do pray for them not to be the one getting killed. But think about this. That's why we call it the sacrifice for the greater cause. And in some respects, that's what we're hearing about here. If you're not willing to say, these possessions don't hold me, this family doesn't hold me, I'm willing to follow the Christ, even to the point of death. My own preservation of my own life doesn't hold me. Jesus says, if you're not willing to say that, you're not ready to be my disciple. Still hard, maybe not harsh in the same way that hating other people is harsh, but still very hard. And, but somewhat different. And that's the conclusion of all of these hard things we've heard so far. All right, let me circle back and see what questions we kicked up here that you would like to talk about for a minute?
How does giving up your possessions differ from the rich young man who asked how to get in?
I don't know that it does, right?
Seems like the
Um,
same thing.
Yeah. So there are not many people to whom Jesus looked and said, you have to give up everything you have and follow me, right? There's somebody like Zacchaeus who welcomed Jesus into his home. And the fact that Jesus came to his home, Zacchaeus spontaneously says, half my possessions I give to the poor. If I defrauded anybody, I'll pay him back 4 times. And Jesus did not say, well, that's not quite enough. All your possessions you have to give to the poor and follow me. He didn't say that. He said, today salvation has come to this house. So it's not like a general rule that everybody Jesus meets, Jesus says you have to sell everything you have and hand it to somebody else. Now you can be my disciple. Jesus was dependent on the largesse of other people. Every time he ate a meal and every time he spent the night inside rather than outside. So what we are talking about here, it seems to me we're not talking about literally dispossessing yourself of everything. But again, when I say that, I'm not trying to make it easy and friendly for us. I don't want this to be a user-friendly Bible here. But I want to be realistic about the larger picture. Not everyone was asked to enter a life of poverty. But I think it's edgier than we want to make it. I think we want to make it like, well, you should be willing that if Jesus came and asked you face to face, will you give up your car? You'll say yes. I think it's more than that. And I think there's a reason why it's more than that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the Apostle Paul is writing in response to some questions that the Corinthians sent him. And apparently they were asking, should we remain married if Jesus is coming back immediately? And that was their expectation. That was Paul's expectation. That was the early church's expectation, that the second coming is going to happen really, really soon. And if you know the second coming is going to happen, within your lifetime, would that change the way you act? Of course it would. Why would you plan for the future? Why would you care about inheritance? Some people would ask, why would we bother having children? If children are all about investing in the future, why would we build a building that will outlast the rest of us? Why would we care about the environment? Why would we invest money in something that doesn't come to fruition till later? Why would you plant a tree? All right, so all of these things that we do in the normal course of life, the Corinthians are asking, well, if the second coming's happening right now, why do these things? And on the one hand, the Apostle Paul in this chapter, it's kind of long and a little bit convoluted, but on the one hand, he seems to be saying to them, look, I'm not telling you to leave your spouse, not telling you to hate your family, hate your kids. I'm not telling you to do that. But I would say this, Paul says, if you're widowed, don't get remarried. You're better off the way you are. And if you're not married, don't seek to get married. You're better off the way you are because the times are going to be difficult. And if you're more worried about the welfare of somebody else, if you've got those concerns, those legitimate concerns, this is your family. If you've got those concerns, it's going to be more difficult for you. If you're not connected to others, if you don't have a spouse, you don't have children, you're probably better off because can perhaps more easily give your life, because the days are going to get really dark before the second coming. It's going to be tough. um, and so imagine that if you think there are impending days of difficulty and doom before the second coming happen, and that those days are among us. First of all, you don't invest in long-term things, and secondly, uh, you try to guard your affections to where I would be much more broken by my family being attacked than by myself being attacked. There's no question about that in my mind. As much as I like myself, um, it, please let it be me, not them. Right? You have this. That's what it means to love somebody. Um, and Paul is like, I mean, you can do it, and I'm not saying you have to leave people you love, and don't do that. But just be aware that it's going to be more difficult for you if you have those values and loyalty. I think the 7th chapter of 1 Corinthians is exactly what Jesus was talking about, and exactly what Luke is trying to say to his audience through writing this gospel is, listen, these are not going to be happy days. These are uncommonly difficult days. And in doing so, you have to really ask yourself if you've got the wherewithal to see it through. Because you can't just kind of jump in and say, I'm all in. And without knowing that it could be really costly. So I would leave that to you to kind of read on your own. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, I think Paul is trying to answer the same kinds of questions and trying to offer the same answer, only his questions have been specific to the question of marriage and family. Okay, any other question?
What was happening in Luke to make Jesus talk about this?
In the flow of Luke's story? Yeah. Here's a story that the lectionary skipped over. And that is actually the story behind Ched Meyer's title. It's the beginning of chapter 14. And it's, I'm going to make a word connection here that you're going to appreciate, but you only heard it from me. Don't take it as gospel. The first story in chapter 14 is that Jesus went to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat. So we picked up on the second half of that story last Sunday and Saturday when we read about the people choosing the best seats and so forth. Before that, however, Jesus is met with a man who has what's called dropsy in the scriptures, right? Verse 2, just then in front of him was a man who had dropsy. Sometimes it's translated pleurisy. I think a better translation, he had edema, which is fluid, too much fluid. That's what that word dropsy is trying to indicate. It comes from the word hydro, the word dropsy. So that he's got too much fluid. He's got too much. And in a lot of ancient literature, somebody who had dropsy or edema, it was a symbol of somebody who had too much stuff. They have too much. Not like a man with a withered hand who doesn't have enough. Doesn't have enough blood flow and all of that. He's got too much. So is this a literal person who's got swelling from edema? Well, could be. But is it somebody who represents fat cat somebody who represents the obesely wealthy. Probably. Yeah, it certainly worked. This was a type character in a lot of literature of that time. This disease signified having too much. And Jesus heals him from having too much. That's why Ched called his book Healing Affluenza. There's hope for us who have too much. It seems like what's going on in the story is that Jesus, they were watching him, to see if he would heal himself. Jesus is on his way to his death, and he's being followed by many people, lots of crowd. There's a story a little bit earlier where Jesus looked at someone and said, "Follow me," and they said, "Sure, I'll come. I've got a doctor's appointment on Tuesday, and then I'll follow you on Wednesday." And Jesus looks at another person and says, "Follow me," and says, "I'm happy to do it. I'm getting married in a couple of weeks, and then we're going to go on a honeymoon. Then I'll come follow you." And I'm contemporizing it, obviously. But 3 times he asked somebody, "Follow me," and each of them had something to do. I need to wait until my dad dies and bury him properly, and then I'll follow you. Each of the examples in that story are mother, father, brother, sister, yada, yada. And Jesus responds that no one putting their hand on the plow and looking back is able to work for the kingdom of God. So there is that foreboding sense that Jesus is getting ready to die. And anyone who's not willing to kind of follow him on that difficult path, he might be popular, but that's not the same as having disciples. That punctures the balloon of every church growth theory in the world, doesn't it? Being popular is not the same as having disciples. Disciples are those who will take on the work of Christ, including its dangers, as opposed to simply admiring Jesus for being so great. And so the closer they get to Jerusalem, the more pointed I think it gets. That's what I think is happening in the flow of the story, and that's why it's a lot harder when Jesus says, "Anyone wants to be my disciple must carry their cross and follow me," than it was back when Jesus looked at a couple fishermen who were cleaning their nets and said, "Hey, come follow me." And they're like, "All right." And then, 8 chapters later, suddenly like, "Wait a minute. I didn't read the fine print. Follow you where exactly? Where are we going? We're going to die?" So that I think that's what's happening in the flow. Okay, we are well past 11 o'clock, and I have an 11 o'clock Zoom call, and so I am late, and you are detained. It gets better, y'all. It gets better.
But it ends bad.
Just remember, I didn't write it. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it. So, Ann, you can stop the recording.